A boy's journey beyond death leaves the world shaken with an unsettling message from heaven. In the quiet town of Imperial, Nebraska, the Burpo family's ordinary life was suddenly turned upside down when their lively 4-year-old son, Colton, faced a life-threatening medical emergency. What unfolded next defied all explanation. After narrowly surviving, Colton began sharing vivid, extraordinary details of an experience that seemed to transcend life itself. He spoke of breathtaking visions of heaven, encounters with angels, and even meeting Jesus. But his story wasn't just about peace and beauty. Colton returned with a message, one so startling and profound, it left his family and everyone who heard it in shock. This revelation challenged their beliefs about life, death, and the mysteries of what lies beyond. Before moving ahead, if you also believe in God and Jesus, then definitely subscribe to the channel and spread the faith and love of Jesus by sharing the video. It was a typical spring day in 2003 in Imperial, a close-knit Nebraska town where neighbors greeted each other warmly and life moved at a steady rhythm. The Burpo family, consisting of Todd, Sonia, their son Colton, and his sister Cassie, was a reflection of this community, faithful, hardworking, and deeply connected. Todd, the local pastor, balanced multiple roles to support his family. He was not only a preacher, but also a volunteer firefighter, coach, and handyman. Despite his busy schedule, Todd's love and dedication to his family never wavered. Sonia, a school teacher, juggled her career with the responsibilities of raising their 2 children. Colton, at just 4 years old, was the heart of their home. With his blonde hair, infectious grin, and endless curiosity, he brought joy and energy to everyone he met. He was especially close to his father, eagerly accompanying him on errands and mimicking his every move. Life for the Burpos was hectic, yet fulfilling, grounded in love and faith. But this picture of happiness began to crack when Colton fell ill with what seemed to be a minor sickness. Little did they know, this would set the stage for an unimaginable journey, one that would forever change their lives and challenge everything they thought they knew. In January of that year, Colton came down with what seemed like a typical stomach virus. He had a fever and complained of stomach pain, symptoms Todd and Sonia assumed were the flu. But as the days passed, Colton's condition didn't improve. Instead, it got worse. His pain intensified and he began crying out, clutching his stomach in agony. Sonia, usually calm under pressure, became alarmed. His cries were unlike anything she'd ever heard, piercing, desperate, and filled with a pain no parent wants to hear. Concerned, Todd and Sonia took Colton to their local family doctor. After examining him, the doctor found no clear cause for concern. He chalked it up to a severe case of the stomach flu and reassured them it would pass with time, hydration, and rest. Todd, always the steadying force, tried to comfort Sonia, insisting that everything would be fine. But deep down, unease gnawed at him. Something about Colton's condition didn't sit right. Over the next few days, Colton's situation worsened dramatically. His pain grew so intense that he couldn't stand without screaming. Sonia, overcome with worry, called Todd at work, her voice trembling. "Todd, this isn't normal," she said, holding back tears. "Something's really wrong. We need to take him back to the doctor." Hearing the fear in her voice, Todd dropped everything and rushed home. They returned to the doctor, but this time, it was clear Colton was in serious trouble. His pale face and glazed eyes told the story before any test could. The doctor immediately urged them to take Colton to the hospital. Todd and Sonia raced against time, driving as fast as they could while silently praying for their son. In the back seat, Colton lay motionless, his tiny body overwhelmed by pain. When they reached Great Plains Regional Medical Center, the medical team sprang into action. Tests quickly revealed the devastating truth. Colton's appendix had burst, a diagnosis the family doctor had missed earlier. The rupture had released toxins into his body, triggering a life-threatening infection. For such a small child, the stakes were even higher. The doctors didn't mince words. Colton's situation was critical. Surgery was his only chance for survival, and they needed to act immediately. Todd and Sonia clung to each other, their hearts heavy with fear, but filled with hope that their little boy would make it through the night. Sonia broke down, unable to hold back the flood of emotions. How had their world turned upside down so suddenly? Just days ago, they were treating what seemed like a harmless stomach bug. Now they were faced with the gut-wrenching reality that their little boy's life was on the line. Todd, though visibly shaken, tried to stay composed for Sonia and Cassie. Inside, though, he was battling despair. Every fiber of him wanted to cry out to God, to demand an explanation, to beg for a miracle. But instead, he channeled his strength into comforting his family. Before Colton was wheeled into surgery, Todd leaned down and kissed his son's forehead. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I love you, buddy." Despite his exhaustion and pain, Colton managed a faint smile. "I love you too, Daddy," he murmured. The simplicity of those words shattered Todd's composure, though he held back the tears for Colton's sake. The surgery was grueling and seemed to stretch on endlessly. Todd couldn't sit still in the waiting room. He paced back and forth, his thoughts spiraling into worst-case scenarios. He tried to pray but found himself speechless. Instead, silent pleas filled his heart as tears streamed down his face. Images of the moments he might lose haunted him. Their father-son adventures, the questions Colton loved to ask, and all the hopes they had for his future. For the first time, Todd felt completely powerless. In the operating room, the medical team was in a race against time. Colton's body was fragile, already ravaged by the spreading infection. The surgeons worked tirelessly to remove the toxins and stabilize him. At one point, his heart rate dropped to a dangerous low, and a wave of dread swept through the room. For a brief, terrifying moment, they thought they might lose him. But during those critical moments, something remarkable occurred. Something Colton would later describe in vivid detail. Though his body lay unconscious, he said he felt himself floating, as if his soul had detached. From above, he watched the frantic scene unfold below. He saw the surgeons working with urgency, the beads of sweat on their brows, and the determined focus in their eyes. What made his account even more astonishing were the details he shared about his parents. Colton described his mother crying in the waiting room, clutching her phone as she called family members, her voice trembling with panic. He also saw his father, pacing back and forth, head bowed in silent prayer. But it wasn't just what Colton saw, it was what he felt. He described sensing his father's anguish and fear as though they were his own emotions, even from afar. When Colton finally woke up after the surgery, Todd and Sonia were overcome with relief. Exhausted and emotionally drained, they sat by his side, holding his tiny hands and whispering words of love and encouragement. But even as they rejoiced, a shadow of fear lingered. The doctors couldn't yet promise that Colton was entirely out of danger. His little body had endured a tremendous ordeal, and the risk of complications remained high. In the days following the surgery, as Colton regained his strength, he began to share his experience with his parents. It started innocently enough. He simply mentioned that he had watched them during the surgery. Todd and Sonia exchanged puzzled looks, not sure what he meant. How could he have seen them in the waiting room when he was under anesthesia, fighting for his life? When they pressed him for more details, they were shocked by what he described. Colton knew exactly where they had been standing, what they had been doing, and even snippets of their conversation. He spoke with the matter-of-fact innocence of a child, unaware that what he was saying was impossible. For Todd and Sonia, it was as if the ground had shifted beneath their feet. Their son had been near death, but he was describing events he couldn't possibly have seen or known about. They listened in stunned silence as Colton continued. He described being pulled upward, away from the hospital room, into a place filled with light. He said it felt warm and safe, like nothing he had ever experienced. "I went up to heaven," he said simply, looking at his parents with wide, sincere eyes. Colton's description of heaven began to spill out in bits and pieces over the following days. It wasn't something he sat down to tell as a complete story. Instead, it came up in the most unexpected ways, in the middle of conversations about seemingly ordinary things. Sonia and Todd were trying to navigate the shock and exhaustion of what they had just been through, still processing the reality that they nearly lost their son. They had prayed so hard, clinging to their faith, but hearing Colton talk about his experience felt like stepping into a new reality altogether. One day, while Colton was resting at home, he casually mentioned seeing a man in heaven. "I saw Pop," he said with the innocent certainty only a child can have. Sonia's breath caught in her throat. "Pop?" she asked, unsure she had heard him correctly. "You mean my dad?" Colton nodded, smiling. He was really happy to see me, he said. He started to describe the man he had met, the way he looked, his smile, and the warmth in his eyes. The description didn't match any recent photo of Sonia's father that Colton had ever seen. Instead, he described a younger version of the man with dark hair and a strong build. Todd, listening intently, decided to show Colton an old family photo album. He flipped through it slowly, pointing out pictures of people he thought Colton might recognize. When he got to a faded black and white photo of Pop as a young man, Colton's eyes lit up. "That's him," he exclaimed. "That's Pop." Todd and Sonia exchanged a stunned look. Colton had never seen a picture of Pop as a young man. They had only ever shown him pictures from later in life, when he was older and had gray hair. The realization sent a shiver down Sonia's spine. She felt an overwhelming mixture of grief, disbelief, and a strange kind of comfort she couldn't quite put into words. As the days passed, Colton continued to talk about the things he had seen. His descriptions of heaven were simple but profoundly detailed, filled with imagery that seemed both childlike and otherworldly. He spoke about vibrant colors, unlike anything he had seen before, describing a sky that seemed to glow without a sun. He talked about the music he heard, not just ordinary songs, but a kind of harmony that filled him with a sense of joy and peace beyond what he had ever felt on earth. He said the light wasn't like the light we have here. It didn't come from one place but seemed to shine from everything around him. One afternoon, while they were sitting together, Colton mentioned something that left his parents in silent shock. "I met my sister," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Todd and Sonia were puzzled. "Cassie?" Colton's older sister was at school, and they assumed that's who he was talking about. But Colton shook his head. "No, not Cassie," he explained. "I met my other sister." The room fell silent as his words sank in. Sonia's face went pale, and her eyes filled with tears. She knew instantly what Colton was saying, but it seemed impossible. How could he know? Years before Colton was born, Sonia had suffered a miscarriage. It was a painful experience, one she and Todd rarely spoke about, even to each other. They had never told Colton about it. He was too young to understand, and they didn't want to burden him with the sadness of that loss. Yet here he was, talking about a sister he had never been told existed. Sonia's hands trembled as she asked him gently, "What did she look like?" Colton's eyes lit up as he described her. "She had dark hair like yours, Mommy," he said, "and she was really, really happy. She hugged me and told me she couldn't wait for you to come to heaven someday." Sonia couldn't hold back her tears. She broke down sobbing, overwhelmed by the sudden wave of emotions. It was as if all the grief she had buried deep inside her heart was being unearthed at once. Todd pulled her into his arms, feeling his own tears welling up. They had mourned that loss quietly, privately, and here was their little boy speaking about it with such certainty, with details he couldn't possibly have known. It felt like a message from beyond, a small glimpse of a life they had lost, but was somehow still there, waiting for them. Colton didn't understand why his parents were crying. To him, it had been a happy reunion. "She said she's okay," he told them earnestly. "She's not sad. She loves you both so much." The words hit Sonia like a physical blow. It was the kind of reassurance she had longed for, but never dared to hope for. She realized then that if what Colton was saying was true, it meant that their lost child wasn't really lost. She was safe, happy, and waiting for them in a place filled with love. The revelation changed something in Todd as well. He had been struggling with his own doubts, trying to reconcile his faith with the harsh realities of the world. He had spent countless hours as a pastor, comforting others, assuring them of God's love and the promise of heaven, but secretly he had carried his own fears and uncertainties. Hearing Colton talk about his sister, seeing the raw truth in his son's eyes, felt like a gift. It was a confirmation of everything he had preached but never fully allowed himself to believe. It was as if God was speaking to him through Colton, giving him a glimpse of the divine plan, a reminder that even the smallest lives were part of something much greater. Over time, Colton's stories continued to unfold, each revelation more startling than the last. One day, while sitting on the couch with his father, he casually mentioned meeting a man who had told him how much he loved him. He had big, strong hands, Colton said, and he smiled a lot. Todd couldn't place who Colton might be talking about, so he asked for more details. Colton looked up, his eyes shining. "It was Jesus," he said simply. "He's really nice, Daddy. He loves everyone." Todd's heart skipped a beat. He had always taught his children about Jesus, but to hear his son speak of meeting him face to face was almost too much to comprehend. "What did Jesus look like?" Todd asked quietly, half afraid of what Colton might say. The boy paused as if searching for the right words. "He had brown hair and a beard," he began. "And his eyes were like the ocean. They were full of love, like he knew everything about me but still loved me anyway." Colton's description was simple but profound. He talked about how Jesus wore a white robe with a purple sash and that he had marks on his hands and feet. Todd felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew what Colton meant by marks, the scars from the crucifixion, the wounds from the nails. It was a detail that Colton couldn't have known, a piece of the story he was too young to fully understand. Yet he spoke about it with the confidence of someone who had seen it for himself. "What did Jesus say to you?" Todd asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Colton's expression turned serious, as if he was recalling something very important. "He told me it wasn't my time yet," he said. "He said I had to go back because he had work for me to do." The boy's voice was calm, but his words carried a weight that left Todd speechless. He pulled Colton into his arms, holding him close as if he could protect him from the enormity of what he was saying. It felt like they were standing on sacred ground, teetering between the world they knew and something far beyond their comprehension. Sonia joined them, wrapping her arms around her husband and son. They sat there in silence, the three of them huddled together, trying to absorb the magnitude of what they were hearing. It was a moment that changed them forever. It was no longer just a story about a near-death experience. It was a message, a glimpse of heaven, and a reassurance that their faith was not in vain. For the Burpo family, it was the beginning of a new journey, one that would challenge their beliefs, deepen their faith, and set them on a path they never could have imagined. As Colton recovered, the Burpo family found themselves grappling with a flood of emotions. They were immensely grateful that Colton had survived, yet they were overwhelmed by the story he was telling them. It wasn't just the trauma of the emergency surgery and the close brush with death that left them shaken. It was the incredible, almost unbelievable details of what he described experiencing while unconscious. Todd and Sonia didn't know what to make of it. They had both grown up in the church, they had read the Bible countless times, and Todd had spent years preaching about heaven, the afterlife, and the love of Jesus. But hearing their son speak about meeting Jesus in heaven as if it were the most natural thing in the world left them stunned and searching for answers. In the weeks following Colton's release from the hospital, the story began to unfold piece by piece, often in the most casual moments. It wasn't as if Colton sat down to give a detailed account of everything he'd seen all at once. Instead, it emerged gradually in snippets during breakfast or while playing with his toys. One evening, as Todd was tucking Colton into bed, the little boy looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Daddy," he said, "do you know how much Jesus loves the children?" Todd was caught off guard by the question, but he nodded. "Yes, buddy, I know," he replied. Colton's expression became even more serious. "No, Daddy," he insisted. "He really, really loves them. He told me." Colton spoke with the conviction of someone who had experienced a profound truth. He wasn't just repeating something he had been taught in Sunday school. It was as if he had come back with a message directly from Jesus, and he felt compelled to share it. Todd felt a wave of emotion he couldn't quite name. He had spent years preaching about Jesus' love, but it was different hearing it from his own child, who seemed to have been touched by that love in a way that went beyond words. It was both comforting and unsettling, a reminder of the divine mystery that they could only glimpse through the veil of faith. Sonia was still trying to process everything as well. She found herself watching Colton more closely, listening intently whenever he brought up his experience. There was no hesitation in his voice, no sense that he was making up a story or embellishing details. He spoke with the kind of honesty only a child can have, as if he were simply describing a trip to the park. One afternoon, while they were sitting together on the porch, Sonia asked him gently, "Colton, what else did you see in heaven? Colton's face lit up with a smile. "I saw lots of animals," he said excitedly. "There were all kinds of horses, and they had really bright colors." "Jesus had a rainbow horse, Mommy?" Sonia couldn't help but smile at the image of Jesus riding a rainbow-colored horse. It was such a childlike detail, so full of wonder and imagination. Yet there was something about the way Colton said it that made her pause. He wasn't just talking about a dream or a fantasy. He was describing it as if he had seen it with his own eyes. As Colton's parents began to share his story with a few close friends, word started to spread. People in their church community were both fascinated and moved by what Colton was saying. Many of them had experienced loss or were struggling with doubts about their faith, and Colton's account of heaven gave them a sense of comfort and hope they hadn't felt in years. The idea that a young child, untouched by the cynicism of adulthood, had seen a glimpse of the afterlife and come back with a message of love and reassurance resonated deeply. But not everyone was ready to accept the story. Skepticism soon crept in, even among people who had known the Bureaus for years. Some of Todd's fellow pastors listened politely but seemed uncomfortable, as if they were trying to reconcile what Colton was saying with their own understanding of theology. Others suggested that perhaps it was just a vivid dream brought on by the anesthesia, or a child's way of processing the trauma he had been through. One friend even hinted that it might be Colton's imagination running wild after hearing so many Bible stories. Todd struggled with these reactions. He understood the doubts. He had wrestled with his own skepticism at first, but he also knew his son. He knew the difference between a child making up a fanciful story and a child speaking from a place of deep, inexplicable truth. He couldn't dismiss what Colton was saying, even if part of him wanted to. It wasn't just the details that were striking. It was the way Colton's entire demeanor had changed. He seemed older, wiser, in a way that went beyond his years. There was a calmness about him, a quiet certainty that Todd had never seen before. Eventually, Todd and Sonia realized they needed to share Colton's story more broadly. It wasn't about seeking attention or trying to convince anyone. It was about spreading the message that had been given to their son. They decided to write a book. Though it was a daunting task, Todd had always been comfortable speaking in front of a congregation, but putting his family's most personal experiences into words for the world to see felt different. It required a level of vulnerability he hadn't expected. Still, they felt a deep sense of responsibility. They believed that Colton had been given this experience for a reason, and it was their duty to help him share it. The process of writing was both cathartic and challenging. As Todd and Sonia went through each part of the story, they found themselves reliving the trauma of nearly losing their son, as well as the incredible moments of revelation that followed. They laughed, they cried, and they prayed together as they pieced together the narrative. Colton, now a little older, was eager to help. He sat with his parents, offering corrections and adding details as they wrote. "No, Daddy," he would say, shaking his head. "It wasn't like that. It was brighter. There was more light." When the book titled Heaven is for Real was finally published, the response was overwhelming. It quickly became a bestseller, resonating with readers across the country and beyond. People from all walks of life, devout Christians, agnostics, even those who had long given up on the idea of an afterlife, found themselves moved by the story. The simplicity of Colton's descriptions, the childlike wonder in his words, made it hard for people to dismiss. It wasn't a complex theological argument. It was a pure, unfiltered account from a little boy who said he had been to heaven and met Jesus. As the book's popularity grew, the Burpo family was invited to speak at churches, conferences, and community events. Colton, still just a young child, found himself standing in front of hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, recounting his experience. He didn't seem nervous. Instead, he spoke with a quiet confidence that left audiences in awe. He would describe the colors, the animals, the angels singing, and the overwhelming sense of love he felt. People listened, with tears streaming down their faces, some whispering prayers of thanks, others holding on to every word as if it were a lifeline. Not everyone believed, of course. There were skeptics at every event, people who came to challenge the story or dismiss it as a child's fantasy. But Colton didn't argue or try to convince them. He simply told his story, leaving it up to the listener to decide what to believe. Todd watched his son with a mixture of pride and amazement. Here was his little boy, who had once clung to him in fear, now standing before strangers, sharing a message of hope and love that seemed to come from a place far beyond his own understanding. For countless individuals, listening to Colton speak felt life-changing. Those grieving the loss of loved ones found solace in his words, seeing them as a reassuring sign that their departed were at peace in a place radiant with light and love. It was as though a hidden door had been opened, offering a rare glimpse into a realm many could only dream about. Colton's sincere and heartfelt testimony struck a chord deep within, a universal yearning to believe that death is not an end, but a transition into a life more wondrous than imaginable. As time went on, the Burpo family realized their lives would never be the same. They were no longer just an ordinary small-town family from Nebraska. They had become bearers of a story that seemed to transcend the boundaries of time and space. This story carried a profound message, one of hope, faith, and the promise of a reality beyond the earthly existence. The response to Colton's account exploded after the book's release and the accompanying media attention. What had begun as an intimate, deeply personal family experience transformed into a global phenomenon, captivating millions. For Todd and Sonia, this newfound spotlight was both uplifting and challenging. On one hand, they were deeply moved by the countless letters from people who found comfort and renewed faith through Colton's story. On the other hand, they were confronted with waves of doubt and criticism they hadn't foreseen. Initially, the support came from close friends, neighbors, and their church community, who shared words of encouragement. People expressed how Colton's story had rekindled their faith or provided comfort in times of grief. One woman, grieving the recent loss of her husband, tearfully told Sonia that she finally felt a sense of peace after hearing Colton describe a place filled with light and love. "I prayed for a sign," she whispered, holding the book close to her chest. "Your son's words were exactly what I needed to hear." But as the story gained national attention, the reactions became more complex. Media outlets across the country began covering the Burpos, and the family appeared on major television networks. They participated in interviews and shared their story on talk shows, recounting their experiences repeatedly. Colton, still just a child, sat beside his parents, quietly listening and occasionally answering questions about the details of his journey. He spoke with the same innocent certainty, his wide eyes filled with sincerity as he described Jesus, the angels, and the heavenly world he had seen. As the story gained more public attention, it inevitably drew increasing scrutiny. Skeptics began raising doubts, especially on social media and online forums. They questioned the authenticity of Colton's experience, suggesting it might have been shaped by his upbringing in a deeply Christian home. Of course, he saw Jesus, some critics argued. That's what he's been taught his whole life. It's just a mix of a child's imagination and the trauma of surgery. Others leaned on scientific explanations, citing research on near-death experiences and the effects of anesthesia. They proposed that Colton's visions were more likely the result of hallucinations from oxygen deprivation than a genuine glimpse into the afterlife. For Todd, a pastor who had spent years preaching about the transformative power of faith, this new wave of skepticism presented an unfamiliar challenge. He had always taught that personal testimony was sacred. Each individual's encounter with God was unique and valid, but now confronted by criticism from strangers who knew nothing of their family, he struggled to respond. He felt an intense protectiveness over Colton, who had shared his story with unguarded innocence, only to see it picked apart by others. Sonia, too, felt the sting of the backlash. Naturally more reserved and less comfortable in the public eye, she found the criticism deeply unsettling. In quiet moments when it was just her and Todd, she voiced her fears. "What if people think we made this all up?" she would ask, her voice heavy with worry. "What if they think we're just seeking attention?" Todd would pull her close, trying to offer comfort, though he couldn't completely silence the knot of anxiety in his own heart. Their intention had never been to create a spectacle. They had simply wanted to share what they believed was an extraordinary message entrusted to their son, a message of love, hope, and the promise of heaven. The skepticism extended beyond the digital world. At public events, Todd noticed a shift in the tone of the questions they were asked. While many still approached with gratitude and tears, sharing how Colton's story had brought them peace, Others were more skeptical and even confrontational. At a book signing event, one man boldly asked, "Don't you think it's possible your son's visions were just a dream? Or maybe he's just saying what you want to hear?" Todd was caught off guard by the directness of the question, but took a deep breath and responded with calm conviction. "I know my son," he said quietly. "I've seen the way his eyes light up when he talks about what he saw. This isn't something we taught him, it's something he experienced." Despite Todd's sincere effort to address the skepticism, the criticisms showed no sign of abating. Some accused the family of exploiting Colton's story for financial gain, especially after the book became a bestseller. The newfound success allowed the Burpos to pay off mounting medical bills and make much-needed repairs to their home, but the accusations still cut deep. Todd, who had always taken pride in living a humble and honest life, was stung by the notion that others saw them as opportunists. The idea that people believed they were profiting from their son's profound experience felt like a blow to everything he stood for. Amidst the turmoil, Colton remained blissfully unaware of the swirling controversy. At his core, he was still just a child, more preoccupied with playing with his friends and exploring the world than with debates about heaven or near-death experiences. His innocence became a source of strength for Todd and Sonia, a poignant reminder of the pure reason they had chosen to share his story in the first place. Colton continued to speak about his journey with the same quiet confidence. For him, there was no room for doubt or argument. It wasn't about convincing anyone. It was simply the truth of what he had seen. After one particularly grueling interview where the host had persistently challenged Todd with scientific counter-arguments, he came home feeling drained. As he stepped into the backyard, he spotted Colton playing with his toy truck in the late afternoon sun, entirely at peace. The sight of his son, so untouched by the weight of public opinion, brought a lump to Todd's throat. He walked over, knelt down beside him, and wrapped him in a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you, buddy," Todd whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've been so brave." Colton looked up, his small face scrunched in confusion. "Why are you crying, Daddy?" he asked. Todd wiped his tears and managed a smile. "Sometimes people just don't understand," he said softly. "But that's okay. We know the truth, don't we?" Colton nodded solemnly, his gaze steady. "Yeah, Daddy," he said with a simple certainty only a child could possess. "Jesus told me it's real. Heaven is real." The simplicity of Colton's words, "Heaven is real," reminded Todd of a deeper truth. Their purpose was never to convince the world, but to share hope. Todd realized that no amount of skepticism or criticism could diminish the authenticity of what Colton had experienced. For those who believed, Colton's story was a balm for weary souls. For those who doubted, it was a prompt to ponder mysteries beyond human comprehension. As time passed, the family embraced a new rhythm. Todd and Sonia stopped engaging with every critique and focused on what mattered most: the lives being touched by their story. They began to see their journey not as a defense of faith, but as an act of service. Letters continued to arrive, each one carrying a deeply personal story. Parents who had lost children wrote to share how Colton's experience renewed their faith that their loved ones were at peace. Others spoke of finding solace in moments of darkness. Sonia kept these letters in a treasured box, drawing strength from them whenever doubts or negativity crept in. Each note reaffirmed what they already knew, that Colton's simple testimony was bringing light into the world. For Todd, this journey was transformative. The pastor who once sought to defend every detail now understood the true power of testimony. It wasn't about proof, but about presence. It wasn't his job to persuade every doubter or win every argument. His role, he realized, was to plant seeds of hope and trust that God would nurture them. The family began to speak with greater confidence, but also with humility. Their message became one of love, grace, and the possibility of something more. Todd would often say, "We're not here to tell you what to believe, but to share what we've seen and heard. What you do with it is up to you." The whirlwind of attention gradually began to fade, giving the Burpos a chance to breathe and reflect. They returned to the quiet rhythms of their small-town life, but carried with them a renewed sense of purpose. The story they had shared was no longer just theirs. It belonged to everyone it had touched. In the end, what mattered wasn't the debates or the doubts. It was the lives that had been changed, the hearts that had been healed, and the simple message that continued to echo long after the spotlight had dimmed. Heaven is real, and in its light, there is hope for us all. As Colton grew, he became more articulate about his experience. He could explain his vision of heaven with even greater detail, filling in gaps and painting a vivid picture for those who listen. He described it as a place of overwhelming peace and beauty, far beyond what any words could capture. He said that everything in heaven seemed to be filled with light, not just illuminated by a sun, but glowing with an internal radiance that was almost musical in its harmony. He spoke of the flowers that never wilted, the trees that sang softly in the breeze, and the angels whose voices blended into a celestial chorus. It was a vision so bright and full of love that it brought comfort to countless people who heard him speak. As he continued to share his story publicly, the invitations only increased. Todd and Sonia had to make careful decisions about which events to attend, trying to balance the demands of their newfound role as storytellers with their responsibilities at home. Colton, who had once been a shy little boy, seemed to transform when he spoke about heaven. He stood in front of large crowds without a hint of fear, his voice steady and clear. He didn't use complicated language or grand gestures. Instead, he spoke with a simple honesty that disarmed even the most hardened skeptics. It was as if he were just chatting with a friend, recounting something he had seen on a school field trip. One of the most remarkable aspects of Colton's story was how it touched people across different faiths and backgrounds. The message he brought back wasn't wrapped in doctrine or theological debate. It was a message of universal love and the promise of a better place. At one event, a woman approached the family in tears, explaining that she had lost her son to a tragic accident the year before. "I've been so angry at God," she confessed. "I couldn't understand why he would take my boy away. But hearing Colton speak today, it feels like a small piece of my heart has been healed. I believe now that my son is safe and happy, just like Colton described." The woman's words left Todd speechless. He had seen many people respond emotionally to Colton's story, but each time it happened, it felt like a miracle. It was a reminder that they were part of something much larger than themselves. A story that had the power to reach into the deepest corners of human grief and offer a sliver of hope. Todd realized that this was the true gift they had been given, not just the miracle of Colton's survival, but the chance to bring comfort to others in their darkest moments. Despite the positive impact, the skepticism never completely disappeared. In fact, it seemed to grow more sophisticated as the years went by. Colton's story became the subject of heated debates on radio shows, podcasts, and online forums. Critics dissected every detail, some accusing the family of fabricating the entire experience for fame and fortune. There were entire articles written about the psychological effects of near-death experiences, proposing complex neurological explanations for Colton's visions. They pointed to studies that suggested the brain, when deprived of oxygen, could produce vivid hallucinations that felt incredibly real to the person experiencing them. Sonia found these criticisms particularly difficult to handle. She was a mother first and foremost, and her instinct was to protect her son from anything that might hurt him. She worried about how all this scrutiny might affect Colton as he got older. Would he start to doubt his own experience? Would he feel pressured to defend himself against the accusations of people who had never met him? In her quiet moments, she prayed for strength, asking God to guide them through this confusing, often painful journey. Colton, however, seemed unaffected by the noise of the outside world. He continued to live his life with the same childlike wonder he had always had. Even as he grew into a teenager, he played sports, hung out with his friends, and loved spending time with his family. The story of his visit to heaven was a part of him, but it didn't define him entirely. He didn't walk around proclaiming it to everyone he met. Instead, he shared it when asked, with the same simple honesty he had shown as a little boy. It was a part of his life, but it wasn't the whole of it. As the years passed, the Burpo family began to settle back into a new kind of normal. They still received letters and invitations, but they learned to say no when they needed to, focusing on the life they had built together. Todd returned to his duties at the church, and Sonia continued her work with the local school. They found joy in the small, everyday moments: family dinners, movie nights, and trips to the lake. It was in these quiet, ordinary times that they felt the most grateful, a reminder of the miracle they had been given. One summer evening, as the sun set over their backyard, Todd and Colton sat together watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. "Do you remember everything you saw in heaven?" Todd asked quietly, not wanting to push, but curious if the memories had faded with time. Colton nodded, his eyes far away, as if he were looking back into a distant, beautiful place. "I remember," he said softly. "I remember the light and how everything felt so warm and safe. And I remember Jesus." He looked at his father and smiled. "He was so kind, Daddy. He loved me so much."